Hey guys, what's up? Welcome to another Friday night stream. I'm Brandon Hicks, your host, Blender Foundation certified trainer, and I run several things. Indie Stock's the name of my company. I have Blender Unleashed is my blog, and then the Orange Guild is a brand new site that we just launched for Blender training. Tonight, I'm going to be giving out 10 free annual subscriptions to the Orange Guild. That's about a $200 value. So for anybody that's watching right now, at some point during the stream, I will post a link, and you will be able to use that link to jump into the Orange Guild, sign up for free, and you'll get the next 12 months of training absolutely on me as a thank you for tuning into the stream tonight. So, all right, let's jump in and start working on the scene we picked up from last night. So, let's quickly turn on cycles here and see where we left this. So just to recap from last night, what I'm trying to do right now is jump in and start getting a feel for the lighting and then the basic materials for the scene. So nothing we're doing right now is going to be finalized, but it's just going to give us an idea of where we're headed for the next part of this project. So everything's still pretty much grayscale. We got a few materials started, but nothing finalized, obviously. So at this point, I'll keep moving forward through these materials, and I'm going to try to touch on stuff that isn't a repeat of last night. So we already talked a little bit about some basic paper materials and getting those going. And so let's look at some of these other objects and see what else we can work on. So right off the bat, this green area down here is going to be sort of a leather tabletop. It's actually kind of based on a desk that I have or I used to have. And so it's like a cherry wood around the outside edges. And in the middle, there's this green leather surface that is sort of an executive type desk. So this is going to be a green leather. And let's jump in and start working on that. So just basically getting started, I'm gonna want, well, let's just grab the green color from the viewport and start there. You can see how just that one change really darkens this up and changes the vibe of the image. So we need to play with, how this is looking. And something to be aware of as we get into doing this at this point is anything drastic that we change on the lighting or the materials now, one is going to affect the other and vice versa. So the best thing to do would be to kind of get the lighting blocked in, leave it the way it is, and then work your materials up to a certain level. And that way you have a consistent look for your scene. That's not realistic in the strictest sense of the word because it's kind of an impossible challenge to never tweak anything after a certain point, but that's kind of the goal, is to move through the process one phase at a time. And so now that we've kind of got our lighting in a good place, I want to kind of adapt the materials to work with that. Now, if you are using something like a PBR workflow, like we were talking a little bit about last night, the benefit of that, which is something else we can kind of get into and discuss, is that if you're using the principled shader, using a PBR sort of workflow, the idea with that setup is that the lighting doesn't need to change. And so no matter what environment you bring those materials into, you're going to be able to maintain the same sort of material settings with minor tweaks to make them look physically realistic. All right, so we got a question in the chat. DevCoda says, can you show how you get that lighting? Yes. So I'll quickly cover this. This is a pretty basic setup. I'm using cycles, and I basically just have a few spot lamps in the scene pointed at different areas, and we're getting a really soft kind of shadowing with these. So if we jump into the settings, you can see that I've turned the size up for the shadows, so they're going to be really, really soft. I've also turned up the blend on most of these so that it's going to be a little bit less harsh on the edges where that's falling off. And then I've also mixed in some other lights. So we've got an area light, sort of rim lighting, a slight bit in the background. And then let's see what else we have. There's another spotlight here. So 3 spotlights, four spotlights. This is a point light, and that's just to highlight a little area on the book, a little journal right here, that is going to have one of our hero objects placed there when we get through with the illustration. And then there's a couple of other things going on here. So in the back, we've got some mesh lights going on. You can see I've added an emission shader. I am using Filmic, if you know what that is. That's under your color management down here. So the lights have to be a little bit more intense in this case for that to work out. And then I've got a couple of flags in the scene. So these are basically just adding shadows and taking away light. And all they are basically a diffuse material. And I do have transparency added in the mix, but I have this turned off. And the reason I have that going is so that I can play with the transparency of the flag so that I can choose whether to block or not block all of that out at the same time. So that's the basic lighting setup in a nutshell. I'm not using any sort of HDR so far. I probably will before I wrap this up, but right now you can see all these settings are turned off. So yeah, that is kind of the setup right now. All right, so getting further into this, let's jump back into the concept art from our project. So let me pull that up. So this is kind of what we're looking at as far as trying to replicate here. So this was painted in Photoshop, and all of these little objects are highlighted with different lighting and things like that as we get through this shot. But it's supposed to be sort of a dark film noir type of, sort of scene setup. So it's going to be in color, but it's going to be a little darker. And you can kind of see here what I was talking about with the desktop. We've got a leather surface here, a little rough, kind of a little bit of a coat, a sheen maybe, and then we got some hardwood on the corner here. And we'll have to play with that as we go. So we haven't got into texturing yet, but we are building our base shaders. Okay. So I'm not super concerned about much right now other than getting some of these basic colors in here. And we can play a little bit with how we're going to add a little bit of gloss. So we'll throw a gloss in there. And we'll use a basic mix shader. This is where we get in with the idea of creating a more physically realistic shader. We're going to need to use something called Fresnel, the Fresnel effect, to give the object a sort of sheen when the light hits it at a glancing angle. So if you're facing it straight on and it's a sphere, it's going to kind of be not highlighted, but as it curves away from you and it hits reflections from the environment and the lighting, you're going to get more of that bounce light happening. And that's sort of the Fresnel effect in a nutshell. All right, so you can kind of see what that did a little bit. We're getting random highlights here and there. The roughness is going to be something we'll have to tweak as we get into texturing this up. But I'm going to start with something like a 0.1. And that way we're still getting a little bit of highlight from those overhead lamps. But I don't want that to be like a mirror reflection. So we need to keep the roughness up a little bit there. Okay, and before we get in here and start playing with, bumping and all of that stuff, I'm going to really quickly run through the rest of the scene and just try to throw some base shaders on everything that we have going on here. So one of the things we talked about doing last night was copying the start of a node tree and then just tweaking it as a way to speed this process up. So I'm just copying and pasting these to get started for our postcard back here. And we're not going to really want to have any of that parchment paper type of effect happening. So I'm going to get rid of that. And let's change the color a little bit more to be in line with this shader. So let's copy the viewport color. Let's pull that in here. And there we go. So DevCoda asks another question. Beckman Glossy is more realistic reflection or GGX is better? It just depends on the application that you're going for. GGX, depending on what you're doing, can be a more accurate highlight for the way that it bounces the rays around the scene and reacts to the light. And then even within GGX, you've got different you've got GGX and then you got multi-scatter. Multi-scatter tends to be a little bit more accurate, but you know, the usual cost for that is going to be that if it's more accurate, you're going to get more noise, or I mean, not more noise, but you're going to get more render time. In some cases, you're going to get less noise, but it's not going to be as accurate. So it's all trade-offs. You just have to decide for yourself what looks the best. There's technical mathematical explanations for all of that, but to be honest, I don't really jump in and memorize all that kind of stuff. I just kind of do whatever looks best and learn as I go. All right, so let's jump back into the postcard here. All right, I need to pause 1 second, so I'm gonna switch back to the screen real fast. Okay, turn off one of my notifications there. Okay, all right. So again, when we copy these viewport colors over, they're tending to be pretty saturated and unrealistic. So we need to really dial this back. And in this case, I'm going to end up texturing this anyways. So we just want a base to get started with something there. I'll probably come back and tweak the bump a little bit to give it a little bit of grit there. But in this case, I'm not really going to worry about it. And we don't actually need that. That was from something we were playing with last night. Okay, so let us play a little bit with the porcelain that is going to be on the teacup and the saucer over here. So I'm going to Shift S with node regular turned on. We'll switch out a node, so I'll switch this over to a glossy. In this case, we're going to want to take this down. From what I remember, sharp will give you perfectly mirror-like reflections. So you were asking a little bit about the difference here. GGX, I've heard, is a little bit more accurate. Again, I think you just have to get in here and look at the distribution and see, you know, what you like better for each circumstance, because they're all here for a reason. They weren't just added to be added. So if I have two objects sitting close together that are using the same glossy type, sometimes I'll switch one to the other just so you get a little variation in reflection. So that's something you can kind of do as a little hack to break up the scene a little bit. So usually I use GGX, but it tends to be a little sharper, so I'm going to use Beckman in this case. And I want to get in here and actually see a little bit better. So I'm going to zoom in on the cup here. There we go. Okay. So right now it's looking very metallic, and we need to add in a bit of a different type of combination like we were doing before to give it some more porcelain type of effects. So you were asking, how do I do that? So can you be a little bit more specific? And I'll try to address what your question is. Oh, okay. The render zone over here is a Shift B on the keyboard, and it'll let you draw a box. And that's the same option as you find under the render settings right here called border. So if you check that on and off, and then Shift B will let you draw a box. So it's really handy. And then I've got the camera set up here, but it actually works in the 3D viewport too. So if you were to start rendering and then you Shift B with cycles turned on, that will select a box. If you use it without cycles turned on, it'll just zoom into an area. So that's something that's kind of cool too. But it's the same keyboard shortcut. So as this cleans up a little bit, you can see kind of the effect we're getting. It's still a little too metallic. And in fact, we're probably still going to want to use that same Fresnel idea. This same 3-node setup, 4-node setup is something that I use as a good basis for almost all of my materials. I can't promise it's the most scientifically accurate, but from everything that I've seen on the web, this little setup with a diffuse and a glossy and a Fresnel, either with the layer weight node or the Fresnel node and a certain value typed in. For glass, for plastic, for metal, for almost anything, this will be a good basis, and then you can kind of tweak things as you go and play. So if we just look at the facing value here, and I created that with the node wrangler using Control, Shift, and left click, you'll be able to cycle through any output in cycles, and this is how I quickly build shaders, because I can tell where it's applied. So with Fresnel, you can see on the glancing edges, on the angles there, it's going to be a lighter value to reflect light more. Any of the darker values are going to be less reflective in terms of bouncing light back to us. So the facing angle is going to be an even more extreme version of Fresnel. And if you use this blend here, you can actually change how this behaves. So 0 will give you all black, 1 will give you pure white, and sometimes you just want to artistically dial in how that's working. And that's what this blend value will do for you. So to ultimately see how this is playing out, you need to ring enable the shader. But you can see that's looking a little bit more like porcelain. And in this case, we might even want to add a little bit of ambient occlusion, or not ambient occlusion, subsurface scattering into this. And so we might play a little bit with that. So let's grab the subsurface. Now this will really slow the render engine down. So you want to be careful with how much you use this in what you're doing. But this can be pretty cool in the way that it works. So, oh, it's actually trying to update right now. So ambient occlusion can be added a couple of ways. Let me let my Blender update real fast before it crashes, and then I'll come back. Please don't crash, I haven't saved yet. That's okay, we haven't really done much yet. So yeah, there's two basic ways to add ambient occlusion into the scene. You actually have an ambient occlusion node in cycles that you can use, and then you've got an ambient occlusion in your world settings that I can show you how to turn on. So it looks like this may crash on us. So let me go ahead and restart real fast. Oh, there it went. There it went. Okay. Save. Now we'll start the render engine back up. So let me get this going real fast, and I will show you how to use the ambient occlusion. First of all, you have to have geometry that has a lot of edges that are kind of butting up against each other, or it won't really work. So that's something to be aware of. I'm using AMD GPUs instead of NVIDIA, so it's using OpenCL to power cycles, which is, it always takes a bit for it to start up in the viewport. If I don't get this going, I'm just going to kill the subsurface. It's not worth it. Oh, come on. Okay, let me turn that off. And I'm not going to use subsurface right now. Okay, so let's jump into ambient occlusion. All right, so with the ambient occlusion turned on, you can see what it's doing. Any of these little edges on the teacup on the plate right here, it's gonna self-shadow. So if they're next to each other, it kind of bounces light into there or occludes the light from getting in there so that the shadow is more pronounced. So if you were just compare this to the shader that we just had, or maybe just the diffuse part, you can see how faint these shadows are right here. But if you turn ambient occlusion on, you can see you're getting a much more defined version of that. So what you can do is, if you want to turn it on for everything in your scene, you can jump over to the world settings and check off this ambient occlusion box. And then you can add the effect on top of the scene. So if I turn this down to 0, we're back at our original. And then you can slowly increase this to add that self-shadowing effect back into your scene. Now, a little bit of this goes a long way, because if you crank this all the way up to 1, you're going to get your scene's going to brighten up quite a bit. And then you're going to lose all the moodiness of what's been going on. So if I were to render this whole thing now, you can see how we lost all of the mood lighting that we just created, basically. So maybe something like a 0.1 to start off with would be good. And then the shader is nice because you can add it on a point-by-point basis. So if you only want it to affect one object, then you can mix this in, and it'll work out for that. So this distance will change how close and how far the shadows are spreading in and out. So if you were to lower this down a lot tighter, you're going to get tighter lines. And I believe that's in Blender units. I had this cranked up pretty high because I was doing just a clay render and I wanted really soft shadows. So that's something you can do. But anyways, I'm going to turn this off right now because it does add render time and I don't really need it right now. But that's something cool that you can kind of do there. And you can mix this in with any of the other shaders. So if you want to use something like an add shader, you could add this on top of the existing shaders. And again, this is going to be based on the color input here. So the darker you make this, the more like the original it's going to be. So you can see there's not really any difference there. And then if you want to just kind of slowly bring this up, it's the same sort of effect as turning up the intensity down there. You could also plug a color into this. So an image map, something like that would also work. So DevCoda has not a great computer. I completely empathize, man. I worked with that for a very long time before I was able to start building my own. So I feel your pain, man. Working on a laptop is the worst, but you know, luckily we have Blender and not Maya. So can't really even use that on a laptop. All right. So we need to play a little bit with this to kind of get this feeling a little bit better. Textures are going to help a lot. But we can play a little bit with how this is looking down here. So what I like to do is isolate the materials or the nodes one by one and work on the settings before I combine them back together. So do I think that the shiny part of this porcelain is going to be sharper reflections than this, or is it going to be even duller than this, more spread out? Or do I think I have it kind of right? Well, it's important to start realizing too that maybe we have layers to work with, because there might be more than one type of reflection with this material. So think about how they generate this porcelain. Let me pull up my Pinterest board that has my reference in it. And let's take a look at some of the reference that I picked up for this project. All right. So this is currently under my Blender Unleashed profile, but if you look at the T-set section for this illustration, we get a lot of different versions here to look at. And so the way I start thinking about generating materials is I look at as much reference as I possibly can of an object, and then I start figuring out how to break down those layers, right? So if we're going to use something, we know it's going to be probably kind of white porcelain with a pattern on it somehow. I don't think we're going to do something completely covered like this. It's a little too fancy for this. So let's start off with an image that's more like this. And I'm going to open this up. And let's see if we can actually get the image opened. Okay, so that's about as big as we got it right here. All right, so that's a little low res. Let's find a different version that's better than that. We'll see if this one's higher res. No. Okay, 1 second. Just find a better way to do this. Images, size, large. All right, now I'm looking for one that has some highlights, so we can kind of play with seeing how that's reacting to the light. All right, so let's start with this because it's just an image. Okay, there we go. Real big. Okay. So if you look at this porcelain, and it's going to look a little weird in this case because it's got nothing on it, so it almost feels a little plasticky. But what we're looking at is basically, obviously on the outermost layer of the porcelain, you've got sharper highlights, right? So it's not quite mirror-like. You know, they're still not super sharp, but you can kind of see the edges of the reflections and all that stuff. Now you'll also notice a little bit of breakup in the edge of that curve, which means we've got a little bit of surface bump happening there, right? Now you'll also notice, if you look at some of these other areas of the highlights, that not every highlight is a perfect reflection of the surrounding environment. Some of these highlights are really, really soft. And so at the angles that are a bit more glancing, we talk about the Fresnel effect, these edges might be a little sharper in terms of the reflections. But in the middle here, if we're looking at some of these highlights, you can see they're a little bit softer. And so maybe we have a couple of different layers of glossy reflections happening here that we need to pay attention to. And so let's look at how we might layer that up in cycles. It's pretty simple. Anytime you want to add one layer of a node on top of another layer node in cycles, you just have to use a mix shader. And that's the basic rule of thumb. You have two shaders you input here, and this is how you blend them, right? So we can start with this glossy, which we know is going to be a little bit more dull in terms of the reflection. So maybe we even turn this up a little bit more so it's more spread out. If you look at just this part right here on the handle, you can see it's reflecting a lamp in the scene, but it's kind of got a really dull reflection. Now, we want to add another glossy reflection, sort of a top coat on top of this existing shader here. But this one we want to be a bit more shiny, because you can see right here, this looks a little washed out, a little bit like clay without any sort of glaze on top of it. And so we want to fix that. So we'll add in another glossy on top of that. We're going to use the same basic Fresnel idea, just like that. And this time, if we look at the reflections, we want these to be quite a bit sharper. So this is a 0.3. We might even go down to like 0.05. So now you can see we're getting a much more mirror-like reflection with this. And this will actually be brought out quite a bit more as we jump in and start using things like HDR environment reflections and things like that. Because it's only got what's in the scene next to it to reflect right now. We don't have an environment. So now if we look at how these are combined, you're getting a much more subtle variation in the way that that material is coming together. And you need to do this as many times as there are layers of material in your shader that you're working on. So this is just the most clean, most pristine ceramic for this china, right? And so if there's any kind of dirt, any kind of dust, any kind of fingerprints, any of those require a whole separate section of the shader to be added on top of what's already there. And so if we wanted to keep doing this, all we need to do is just continually plug the previous mix shader into the left socket, and then whatever we're adding on top into the right socket, and then we have to decide how we're going to blend them together, right? So that's the basic premise. Now there was a tiny bit of breakup that we saw in the reference, which we could add in there. It's the same basic principle that we looked at last night for this amber material down here. And so we might even just take what is already there and copy it, Control C, then jump back into our china material, paste that in there, and then we'll just connect this up to our displacement. So you can see this close up, what that's doing. That's far too much for this particular material. So I'm going to bring this down quite a bit. And I want it to be almost completely unnoticeable. It's just enough that you really kind of get a feel that something is going on the surface, right? So if we completely lose it, then it's not really doing us any good, but just want a subtle variation there. The other thing to ask yourself is this only going to affect certain parts of the mesh, right? So currently, this bumpy texture is applied 100% all over the entire teacup, the plate, everything. If we want to only put it on areas that have been, scruffed up or things like that, we need to kind of look at creating a texture map that drives the way that's working and then isolate those areas out. And so for this particular case, we're going to want to keep it over the whole thing. But you can see in this highlight right here, it just has a little bit of break up there that's giving us a little bit of bumpy reflection on that surface. And that's what we're after. So you can see here again with the noise settings turned up to, or the sample settings turned up to what they are now, we are still getting noise in this because of our glossy materials that we've added in. There's not enough sampling going on to bounce the light around the scene to clean this up for us. But thanks to Blender's new denoising node, when we render this out, that will hopefully be cleaned up a little bit. And I really like using this for illustrations like this, especially because we are able to clean things up quickly with low samples. And it works for animation, but sometimes you get some weird things happening with the way things move. So you just have to pay attention to your settings on that. So let's play with some other materials. Now the spoon is going to be pretty reflective. It's going to be more like a sterling silver. So in this case, let's just start off with a glossy. And this one's going to be pretty reflective. So we might start off with something like that. So in this case, we would do the same setup, Fresnel layer in multiple types of glossy, play with some coloring, maybe to shift this around and all of that. Right now, I'm going to be replacing that spoon anyways, so I'm not super worried about playing with that, but that'll be a good starter. Now this is going to be tea, so we can start with maybe a glass shader just as a placeholder. Be colored more like that. Doesn't take much to tint it to be a certain color. And now you can actually see the underside of that spoon coming through that tea. So I'm playing with the idea of putting a lemon on the side or something like that. I don't really know if I'm going to do that or not yet, but we'll see how that goes. It'll take a little bit more time. And let's zoom out here and get some perspective. Okay. So this is also going to be a glass. So in this case, it actually is glass. It's going to be a colored glass. And so what I'm going to do is start off with a very simple bluish type of glass. Thanks, DevCode. I appreciate it. It's looking good so far. We'll see how this is looking later as we get going. But okay. So one thing to be aware of, if you didn't tune in last night, is that we are kind of trying to keep things organized according to name. So we've got sterling silver happening for the spoon here. And then this is going to be a shiny silver, so we want this to be a little different. Now the sterling silver, we're gonna cake this up with tarnish and all sorts of stuff happening here. And so we might even change this to a little bit less reflective, so it's a little bit hazier. And then I'm gonna dull this up with a little bit lower intensity for the input color. But on this one, we're gonna swap this out with the same sort of glossy, and I want this to be very reflective, almost like chrome. So we're going to leave that there. It's in a darker place in the image, so that's not going to be as noticeable. But that's that. We're going to fill this up with sugar cubes, which will take some other tweaking, get those in the scene, but here we go. All right, so we're going to be doing a lot more metal here. This is going to be a penny. So let's grab this color as a starting point. Just bright enough to be able to kind of see it. And you can see with the lighting that we have from last night and the scene now being sort of textured, we're getting different vibes, right? So it felt decent last night, but now that we're starting to add all these materials in, we're gonna see things that aren't working anymore. We're gonna see areas that probably need more light, areas where we could remove light maybe, and we need to bump up the contrast again to compensate for the materials that are in the scene. And that's just all part of the texturing process. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time tweaking all of these little settings because we're going to come back and replace everything anyways. Yeah, so in this case, let's just quickly put in some metal shaders for the nickel, diamond, penny. Okay, this can all be the same right now. Currency needs to be some sort of paper. So let's start with the paper that has the least problems right now, which will be this one. And it looks like it's just a diffuse, so I'm not going to play with the layering yet of the bump on the surface or anything. This needs to be somewhat currency green. So again, it's easy to start blending that back into the surface of the desk here. And we need to, make some commitments and then decide to come back and kind of play with where that's all sitting. Okay, we'll leave it there for now. But you can see all of this is really just kind of blending in and disappearing. Some of the objects are working better, like these coins are now a little bit easier to see up top. We're losing the penny, and we're also losing a lot of the definition on the glass here and all of this stuff. So we probably need to add in a little bit more intensity in this side. So let's go ahead and up our strength of our area lights. Pick something like 300. And you can see just by doing that little tweak, we've got some of the shading coming back here, and the edges are a little bit easier to tell what's happening because of the backlighting there. And there's other things we can do too to kind of play with the lighting in the scene. So rather than sitting here and just constantly tweaking all the lights, we can play with things in post. And it's important to be aware of that option as you're going, because it can really give you flexibility and latitude later on down the road. So as an example, if we jump into the render settings for the scene here under the scene tab, and we look under color management, I told you that I was using Filmic. So this is going to be a little bit more accurate representation of the lighting in the scene because of the color space that it's using to render this out as we see it here. So currently it's using base contrast as the look, which is a good starting point for dialing in your values. Low contrast is more like what it's actually seeing. So if you're familiar with taking raw photos with a camera, using Filmic and a very low contrast, this is sort of the washed out look you would get using something like that if you were doing raw video or things like that with a log format. And then if you turn up the contrast really, really high, you're going to get much more saturated values, but things are going to get more contrasted and darker and things like that. So there's other things we can do with this too. If we start with a base contrast or even a low contrast, and we check off use curves, I've already got some curves set up because I was doing a clay render, but if I go ahead and get rid of some of these, so we can, let's just go ahead and reset this. Reset the curve. Okay, so turning this on and off doesn't do anything until you start playing with the curve. But if we add a little bit of a contrast, let's say we darken the scene down here, and then we up the highlights a little bit. And this is just affecting under this C right here. This is just affecting the lights and darks in your scene. So we can increase the brightness of the highlights, lower the shadows, and we're getting a really interesting, you know, moody sort of reflection again. You can also go the other way. So if you want to bring your shadows up, you can do this. And since we sort of have a raw, you know, uncompressed version of the image here that we're messing with before we save it out of Blender into an image format, we have a lot of latitude where we can push and pull those values before they're written to like a JPEG or a TIFF file or something like that. So if you want to wash the image out, you could do the opposite of a curve like that. Makes it look a little bit more flat. So you can see we have a completely different lighting setup now. So this sort of looks like maybe you're sitting in a lit up office, you know, with some lamps on overhead. But if we do the opposite, it's going to start feeling like maybe it's nighttime outside, something like that. And the closer you pull these together, the more contrast that it's going to get. So you can kind of see all the little interesting interactions we have going on here. But by turning that on and off, you can kind of see what's going on. And as we change this back to a base contrast, you can really start to see what's happening. So what's great about this is you can get in here and really dial in, you know, these curves to where if you just want to crush part of this, you can, and then focus on this focal point of the image, which artistically is a really cool thing. And also do crazy weird stuff like this. X-ray sort of freaky thing going on. You can pull the nodes in from the edges and crush the highlights and the shadows. Still add points in the middle. So there's all sorts of stuff you can do. All right, I'll turn this off, leave this back at base contrast, and let's keep playing. Okay, so about 20 minutes, I'm going to be giving away the coupon code for the 10 free spots for the Orange Guild. So if you're hanging around for that, then it's coming up soon. I'll do that about halfway through. And so looking forward to that. All right. So what do we got left in this scene? You have anything left? I think that's a good start. Oh, we got the ticket. Okay, let's do that. So this is going to be more like construction paper type of material. And let's start by just taking the color here. We'll play with this a little bit. And this one, it's going to be a little bit more saturated and darker. And I've toyed with the idea of making this maybe like metallic, like a foil type ticket or something, but I'm not really sure if that's period appropriate for the time frame of the scene, being that it's in the 1920s. I don't know if they had those, so I don't want to go too far outside the scope of what's going on. All right. So what we got next is we got models and we got textures. So I'll let you guys decide. Do you want to think about working on some other models, or do you want to work on textures coming up? DevCoda has already said textures, so that is noted. Anybody else want to weigh in with opinions on what we work on next? I'm going to just notice we forgot to do the pin here, so I'm going to jump in here and do that real fast. Okay, we'll work on textures since no one else is chiming in. All right, so let's do the shiny silver. We already have that one blocked in from here. Yeah, there. And so the blue resin is the only one we haven't done yet. This one's a little bit more like, it's kind of plasticky. It's not plastic, but it's sort of plastic. And if you've ever seen like that faux wood type of material that is marbled or things like that on an ink pen, that's kind of what we're going for here. So it's going to be a fairly saturated blue. but I also don't want it to compete with, I don't want to compete too much with this object that we're going to be adding in here. So we need to make sure we have a little bit of separation from the sapphire color and this here. All right, so okay, and of course we need a Fresnel. Okay, not bad. So DefCode is asking another question. Are you going to add concept drawing on your notebook? So are you asking, am I going to add the texture that you see here onto the actual texture in the 3D viewport for the project? Is that what I'm doing? And if that's what you're asking, the answer is yes. I'm going to get into Photoshop once we have this thing UV mapped and then draw this whole thing out and do that all over again in a different way. Okay, so it's a little too reflective on the way that's working. I think some of that's due to the Fresnel. So I want this to be a little bit more extreme on the edges. So let's dial this back even more. One of the other things you can do if you want to tweak this value even more is add in a color ramp. So if we just look at the facing value here for the blend, and then we look at this comparatively, we can pass this through a color ramp and play with how this is working. So you can see here, black means it's not going to be reflective at all. And then as it fades into white on the edges, it's going to reflect the light more. So play with the way it does that a little bit more like that. Let's see how that looks. Yeah. So it's a little bit more subtle like that. Pull that back. You can even pull the white in more. So that's coming back a little bit. So this will be some sort of marbled type of wood texture probably in here. And let's see what else we got. Okay, this is a diamond texture in here. Make sure we don't have anything else. We have lots of texture up there. Okay, so the diamond texture is going to be a combination of some things to make this look good. So I'm going to zoom in here so we can see this diamond. Now we're getting so close to this right now, like we're never going to be this close in the final render, right? But if you want to get accurate in terms of how this looks. Now I can't even zoom in any further. That's how close I am to this object. But for the purpose of making sure the material is going to work, that's important. So to make the glass or the diamond work, there's a trick that you can find in pretty much all over the web if you're looking at how to build a diamond shape. And basically you need to have 3 glass materials here. And there's a lot of ways to do this, but this is one of the best ways I've found that's a simple setup. So you take 3 glass shaders, 2 add shaders, and then you combine them all together. And the trick to this is that you want to have red, green, and blue as your different colors. So I'm going to set this one as red. I'm going to set this one as green. And I'm going to set this one as blue. And the reason we're doing this is so that our diamond refracts the light realistically. And then for your index of refraction, you want to slightly vary these so they're off of one another. So this is 1.44 instead of 1.45, and this is 1.46, so slightly above. And then you can kind of see what's happening there. Now, if it's, in this case, the roughness is more accurate than you would think because they're pretty reflective. But I'm going to go ahead and lower this down to a 0.002. And I'll just copy that value into all of these. Let's go ahead and make these GGX. And you can kind of see what's happening in terms of the way that's refracting the light. That's more accurate to the way a diamond would work. And if you want this to be a little bit less in terms of the dispersion effect, you can just make these numbers a little closer together. So we might do 1.445 and then 1.455. And with them a little closer together, you're getting a little bit less of that rainbow type of effect happening. And that's really all it takes to get a pretty accurate diamond setup. So let's look at anything else. This is a black sort of metal. So lower this down. It's going to be fairly rough. I don't want it pure black, but something like that's a good starting point. And I'm not even going to worry about Fresnel and everything right now. And then this one is it's going to be sort of a rough silver. So if we start with this type of glossy node, then this one's going to be more like some solder from a soldering iron. Now, I don't know if that's exactly what the material is, but you know, that's kind of the idea. So I'm going to roughen this up a bit more. And you can't even really see it from this angle of the camera, but there's a differentiation between this material and this material. And that's the whole point, is this should be less reflective down here. Okay. So we also haven't set up our journal pages down here yet to have all these other materials. You can't really see them in this case, so I will add those in, but I think right now I'm just going to leave it the way it is. Okay, so let's save. All right, so you said you wanted me to work on materials. Do you have any preference for the type of stuff that I get in here and start working on? Some of these objects might be able to be done quickly tonight, and some of them might not. So I'll get your opinion on that. If you guys in the chat want me to work on anything specific in terms of texturing things up, and then we'll get into the giveaway. So let me know. Let's make sure what I have is there. Okay, so Dev Coda votes the notebook. Anybody else got any votes they want to toss in the ring? While I'm doing that, I'll show off a little bit of what we've currently done with texturing so far. Okay, anything's fine. So we got anybody else? Tobias Kumar, you got any opinion on what you want to see? I think you're the only other person in the chat right now. And that's what we'll get into if anybody wants to see that. So I want to show you guys real fast kind of the way this is working. I do have a Blender Unleashed Pinterest. So if you're familiar with my blog at blenderunleashed.com for Blender, this is kind of where I keep all of my project files and reference saved for the things that I work on. I also have a one for the Orange Guild that has got one pin on it right now that I'm working on. But so this is the concept art. This is for the fountain pen, which I show how to model in one of my courses. And then this is actually the Atlantean Amulet, which I've modeled already, but I'm going to go back and do probably some of that in the course that I'm working on right now. So here's some of the test runners that we've been working on. So this is sort of with the Amulet modeled. I haven't really decided whether this is going to be a metallic texture or some sort of stone. So maybe bronze, like don't really know yet, but that's kind of the idea of that. Been playing a little bit with sapphire textures and things like that. These are a little bit more done up in terms of the finality of the render for the sapphire texture for that model. So I added a little bit of an emission shader on this interior object because it's embedded inside the stone there. And then these are further along. So this one is a much more realistic sort of sapphire material. And then this is kind of where I left it in terms of the final design. So we've got something glowing in here that's emitting some light, and then something. And this is the basic diamond shader that I was pointing out before. And then I just went in and layered in tons of effects to add a little bit of breakup on the surface and all the stuff we talked about tonight. So you asked about how I made the background. It's just a plane. Basically, I didn't even do a seamless light transition up. It's just a plane and the camera's pointed down on top of it. So if we go back to the Amulet test render. Okay, so for this one, it's literally, again, even simpler. It's just an alpha cutout. So I rendered with this transparency on in Blender. Applied this into Photoshop. And then I just did a gradient from the middle out to the edges, and then added some noise. And that's pretty much all it was. So not very hard at all. I think I threw a drop shadow on as a layer style in Photoshop. So pretty simple. That's not even 3D. So yeah, I haven't added these in yet, but this was a sugar cube test I was working on for a cyclable shader. So there's a little bit more going on here with the way this is layered up, but yeah. So issue right now is we're gonna have to. I'm trying to think of a better way to like place these in the sugar bowl because obviously if you just took a bunch and dumped them in there, they're gonna fall in, but because of the way that the thing is set up, I'm trying to decide whether I want to go in and hand put those in a jumbled up sort of way, or if I want to try to do like a hard body like bullet simulation so that we get the physics actually having them drop and then sit inside of that object. Because sometimes that can be a really quick way to just drop a bunch of stuff on top of each other. But yeah, so probably not something for tonight. But all right, so you said you wanted me to work on the notebook. So let's play a little bit. Now, I don't have anything prepped for that. And before we get into that, actually, I'm going to do the giveaway. So let me start off by telling you guys a little bit about what I'm doing. So if I go to theorangeguild.com, hopefully you guys have come on to the website and joined the mailing list. I'm going to start sending out reminders of the streams and giving you guys tutorials that I've uploaded, and there's going to be even more free stuff in the Orange Guild. But basically, theorangeguild.com is kind of what I'm building up right now. And so it's just me right now, but basically I'm on here putting up all my courses that I currently have. So if we go to the training section, you can see all of the courses that I currently have available. These have been on other websites like Udemy and the Blender Market and things like that. But now I'm trying to consolidate all of it into one place so I can pay a lot more attention to you guys. So we're also going to be eventually down the road getting other instructors to come on board and teach and do all that sort of stuff. But right now I'm just trying to get out there and earn a living with this. So you can see the courses that are available here. You can buy them individually if you want to have them where you can log in and just watch them as much as you want, and you don't want to do any kind of membership, you can buy them separately. Or you can get in here and get the membership. So typically that's $19 a month and $199 a year. And so tonight, this is what we're gonna be giving away. We're gonna be giving away 1 year of access to the Orange Guild. So if anybody's watching right now that wants to check this out, you can go to the link that I'm about to post, and you will be able to get a free year's worth of access with all my existing courses and any courses that are coming out next. And who knows how much that will be. So, all right, so here we go. I'm going to post this in the chat. I'm also going to put it in the link description for the YouTube channel. So if anybody wants to access that, then that's all you got to do. So here it comes. And all you got to do is follow that link, and you will be able to get your first year free. So it may ask you for a credit card and things as you create your account, but that's not going to charge you or anything like that if you use the code there. And it should say 100% discount when you go to the link for the year membership. Make sure it still has the year membership selected, not the month to month. And that's how you can use the code. So I'm also going to go ahead and update the link for the YouTube stream right now. So give me just a second to do that. The YouTube stream. Okay. And I'm going to put this at the very top. So all you have to do is go click this, and it should be live. So I would, if you're watching right now, no obligation, entire year or the training for free. I would take advantage of it because I'm probably not going to be doing this too often. So let me go ahead and save this. And there we go. Okay. So hope to see you guys inside the guild. That's going to be a really cool ride. You can jump in and ask me questions like we're doing in the live stream. I have a section just for portfolio review and questions about Blender and things like that. So if you guys want to get in there and chat with me, feel free to do that, and we can keep the conversation going 24/7. Okay, so some of the things to consider as we get in here and start working on the journal are some issues that I've already seen happening with the texturing. So what I'm going to do is kind of maybe address that first before we jump in and start texturing the front pages. But I will try to get as far on that as I can tonight. So what I'm talking about is if we zoom in here, you can see that we added, I'm gonna let this clean up a little bit. You can see that we added the sort of bumpy, wrinkly paper texture to this area. So the top of this page has this really nice sort of parchment paper type feel. The problem is that the rest of these pages underneath, because we're using an object sort of mapping for this, click the interior pages and kind of show you what that looks like. We're using the object mapping for texture coordinates. So as a procedural texture, it's basically applying this evenly over the entire mesh. So this is kind of a problem on the edges because I don't want this to look like the textures continues to fall off the side. So what we actually need to do here is differentiate the side pages from the top pages. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and take everything that is already got an interior page material, select that, and then I'm going to deselect these top pages so that we have those isolated. Okay, so now what I want to do is add a new texture, and I'm going to start with the interior pages. Then I'm going to create a new version. And I'm going to put the word edges after it. So these are just going to be applied to these edge pages over here. So if I just assign what I have selected, now if I make changes to these edges, this is going to be tweaked. So if I just take off this displacement, we don't really need all that bumping to be there. So we could remove it entirely. We could also just shift it around and lower the effect. So let's say we want to kind of up the scale a little bit. So we still get a little bit of bumping on the pages. Maybe that's too large. So we'll just play around here a little bit until we get something that looks interesting. So with that amount, we have this sort of bigger wavy type of effect happening. And what it's doing is making the pages kind of look like they're uneven, shifting in and out like that. So in this case, that might actually be good. And we need to zoom out a little bit and make sure that at different distances, we're getting what we like there. So we'll play with that. Now, one of the other things we might do is play with some of the breakup on this page before we get in and start texturing. So jump back to the interior pages real fast. And we don't have this UV mapped. So one of the things we can do if we don't want to have to paint this on with a map like that is we can start mixing in other sort of noise textures and things like that on top of the current existing bump. So let's say we just copy our noise pattern here. Let's bring over the same generated idea there. Now let's preview this on our journal. So you can see that's kind of the existing texture that we have right now. What I want to do is maybe have some of that wrinkling intensify in areas and then fade away to where it's a smoother page on other areas. And I just want a really subtle type of effect. So let's lower the size of our noise until we have something pretty big and sweeping like this. And what I'm going to do is go ahead and add another color ramp. And I want to intensify this. So anything that's black, it's basically going to completely remove the wrinkling, right? And anything that's brighter, it's going to be more intense. So in this case, we might play different ways of tweaking this a little bit. So let's say we're happy with the size of kind of how this is looking. We don't like the position of it. Well, what we can do is select this, hit Control-T on the keyboard to add in a mapping node and a texture coordinate. Now I don't want to duplicate the texture coordinate because it's the same thing we have here. So I'm going to pull that into the input there. But now that we have a mapping node, we can kind of play with where this is sitting on the page. So if we play with the location, we can kind of shift this around a little bit. So we get a pattern that pops up that we're a little bit more pleased with. And then we can even play with the scale, so we're getting the same thing happening. And what I love about this with the way Cycles works is it's visually updating for us as we're playing with these settings. So we can kind of see the effect that it's having. So say we're happy with that pattern, but we want it to be a little bit more varied, we can do this. Okay, so now what we can do is if we preview our existing texture here, or let's preview from here. Preview our existing texture here. What we want to do is kind of mix that result with this result to block out some of these areas. And so what we're going to do with that is a mix RGB. So let's plug, we have to decide whether we want to plug this in before we dim it or after. And in this case, let's try with the after. I think that's going to work a little better for us. And we can plug the color into the factor right here and then preview this. So now you can see with the dark values, we're getting a little bit of a drop here in the way this is working. And it's set to mix right now. So if we want to change this to something like a black color, we can play with which direction these are going. There we go. So you can see what's happening there. This is being added on top. So we can play with the mix method too. So we could do add, multiply, subtract. A lots of options here for a way to do that. But in this case, I'm just going to use mix, and then let's preview this again. So what we should see is a drop in the wrinkles somewhere in this area. And I think we are going to see that. Then I promise right after this, we will jump in and start playing with this. So before we see that happening, you can see it's still uniform over the whole thing right now. And we plug this into the displacement instead, and now we should see it smooth out in these areas. And then I'll jump in and start UV mapping, and we'll play with this a little bit. Okay, so we might even turn the intensity up a tiny bit. Thank you. Thanks for the awesome shaders compliment, DevCoda. Okay, so it's still kind of subtle what's happening right now. And I think what I want to do, instead of playing with the value before we mess with it here, is possibly jump in and switch these up. So now I'm going to shift that over there to where we're getting the mix happening before we dim the value back down. That makes sense. Well, good. I'm glad you're learning, man. That's why I'm here. I'm hoping to give away a lot more stuff like this, and I just want to jump in and help you guys out. I know how tough it is kind of learning this, and whether you're a professional and you're just getting started, or you're a hobbyist and maybe doing a little bit of work, or you just want to do some cool stuff. Like there's so much to learn, and it's really cool to be able to learn with people that are passionate with you. So Blender is blowing up right now. It has been for years, but it's still happening, and it's happening even more so right now. With 2.8 coming out later this year, it's going to be nuts. There's so much going on. So yeah, can't wait. It's awesome. Okay, so that lowered the intensity quite a bit when we started mixing this up. So I'm going to intensify this so you guys can see what I'm doing. So yeah, over here we've got a lot of sort of wrinkling happening, and then over here it's tapering off to where those black areas were. So that's a little too much. Let's split the difference back down to a 0.25, and let me take a look. Okay, so that's a good starting point. Let's reset the preview here, and we can jump in and start playing with textures now. So yeah, let's disable the preview, save again. And what's great about this is we don't really need to UV unwrap anything except for the top 2 pages. So we can jump into edit mode. And I haven't done any sort of UV unwrapping for this yet, so this will be sort of a quick process, hopefully. So let's switch to the UV editor. Get rid of the render result. Okay. So depending on what I'm doing, I might use some add-ons for UV unwrapping. In this case, I don't think I have any turned on right now that are available, so I'm not going to go hunt those down. But we can start by selecting this right here. We know that we're not going to need all of this. In fact, if you watch me build this in the course, I even cut out these middle pages so that we're not going to be getting extra geometry in the scene for slowing down rendering and all that sort of stuff. So I killed that. So I just left the top pages intact. And we don't need anything except for the top surface. So we're going to leave all the rest of it alone. And to get started, I'm going to make sure I have both of these selected. I'm going to hide those, or actually I'm just going to separate those off right now so that we can isolate those out. And then I'm going to use the / on the number pad so that those are isolated in local view. So if you've never used that before, it's just / on your number keypad, and that will kind of hide everything else in the scene and let you just work on this stuff. So typically what I would do is, if I was working on an object like this, and I had the original, is I would go back to the original before I added the subdivision surface model modifier, and I would get a clean version of it where it's just laying out flat. And then I would go ahead and apply that by duplicating the data over to this object, so that it was sort of UV unwrapped before it was already disfigured like this. But in this case, like what we can do is go ahead and just do it manually and then straighten it back out. And so in this case, we can grab the edges of everything, and we might, an easier way to do this might be to start from the opposite side. Well, no, all right, I'll just do it this way. We'll see if this works. So if I hit Control plus on the number keypad, as I have something selected, it will grow the selection. And then what we could do is, an easy way to do this might just be to paint all of this in. So using C on the keyboard, we can just grab all of these faces at the same time. And once we have those selected, hide those. And we can do the same basic thing here. So we could grab these on the edges using Shift and then Alt and then right click. We can grab this edge or this row right here. And I don't want the back side. I just want this side right here. So we're gonna go down from, let's say right here, down to this edge here. And we're not even gonna need that much, but we'll just go ahead and grab those two. So I'm hiding everything that I want to be UV unwrapped right now, if that's not clear. And so right clicking on this right here, we're gonna go all the way across to the other side. I'm gonna use Control and right click to draw a straight line all the way across for that row of faces. Hide those. And what I'm doing is I'm isolating all the edges away so that the middle will be by itself, and then we can select all of that at one time since there's no border edges anymore, and then hide all of that. So that'll be clear in a second as we get into this. So hide that, and now with everything in the middle, we're gonna set L on the keyboard, grab all of that stuff, hide. So there we go. So we've got that entire top part of that page now isolated and cut out. So I'm gonna go around and make sure that I don't have any missing pieces from the selection still visible, and then hide those as we go. It's probably be a little easier to do if we hadn't used the C command to draw this out to begin with, but whatever, not a problem. Okay, so grab that whole row. Jump over here and do the same thing. Make sure I don't miss anything because it will be obvious if it's in the middle of some handwriting or something that I forgot to grab something. Okay, so these pages are the same in terms of the poly count and all that sort of stuff. So you could probably figure out a way to just copy this over if you wanted to do that. But in this case, it's not going to take too much time to just grab all of this stuff. So I'm just going to do it by hand. Okay, grab that. Sometimes you can also use something like if you select a face and you hit Shift G, you can select something similar to that. So if they were all the same material, we could select the same material and it would grab everything all at once. Or sometimes you can use normal, and if they're all facing the same direction, sometimes that will help you pick something that's similar in nature. But these are all kind of doing this, so we need to do this more by hand in this case. But I have used that in the past to help me grab a selection quickly. Hide that, and then let's go all the way across again. One more time and we're good. Okay, so everything that is a top part has been hidden. Now if we unhide this, I've got everything selected that's supposed to be UV unwrapped, right? So basically what we can do to safely make sure that we have everything correctly separated out now is I can go ahead and separate these pages so they're separate objects. And that might be something we just do temporarily, but we'll just have to see how it affects the shading. So in this case, I'm going to select these pages here. And we are going to UV unwrap those. So we'll just go ahead and do a regular unwrap, see how that works. We need to decide how we want our texture to be laid out. So in this case, because we already spent the time to set up our base texture and we have the underlying parchment and all that, what we're really talking about doing right now is assigning a transparent alpha material on top of that with our handwriting applied. And so we need to figure out in a texture map how we want to lay out so the texture so that it can be drawn up in Photoshop. So the first question is if we need to kind of undistort what's happening here. Now there's probably not enough going on to cause any major problems in terms of handwriting being stretched or anything like that. To double check that, we can check off the stretch thing here and just see what that looks like. So as we get further into this, you're gonna see the area fold into the middle of the binding. And as it does that, you're gonna get more stretching, which is why these are turning green. But the rest of this is still blue, which tells me that there's not really any problems with the way this is laid out. So I'm not gonna spend a lot of time sitting here and like straightening all these edges up because there's really no point in this case. I can save a lot of time by not doing that. So the only other question we have to ask ourselves is if we want to keep a perfectly square texture, which in most cases you do, or if you'd like to figure out actual dimensions for, like I've had cases where like I had a specific label that had to go in a bottle or something like that. And if you have the dimensions that you've built out specifically by inch or millimeter or whatever for those labels, sometimes you'll get an image format that has the exact dimensions in that aspect ratio. And it helps you to stay in that aspect ratio because it wraps around the bottle in a even way, right? So that's just something to be aware of, as there's different ways to do this. In this case, we need to decide what resolution we want to make this. And so I'm going to save out this UV layout. And here we need to decide what we want to make the resolution. Now, in this case, it's a big object in the scene. And remember, I'm going to be rendering this out for a poster print. And when I say poster, I mean like an 11 by 17 tabloid size poster. So it still needs to be pretty large. So in this case, I'm going to do a 4K texture because there's a lot going on there. And we need to go ahead and start playing with organization a little bit better here. So I'm going to just label this as textures. Let's do journal UVs. Okay. Oh yeah, the multiplication hack. Yeah. So MC just mentioned I should have done the ×4. So what he's talking about is, correct me if I'm wrong, but what he's talking about is doing that. And it would basically multiply that out for you. So Blender's got a lot of really cool tricks in there that you should learn. And they can really help you out in terms of, you don't want to have to do the math in your head. It can do math in almost any of these numerical inputs. You can do basic equations and it will do this for you. Okay, I know it took me a while to get that going, but thank you for your patience. Let's jump back into the local, out of the local view, and we need to play a little bit with our stuff here. So wasn't planning on getting into Photoshop tonight, but since you guys want to watch me texture, I'm I'm assuming that's what you want to watch me do. Am I correct in that? Let's play with the texture first. So I'm going to pull this open into Photoshop. Okay, so we have a transparent PNG. And what I like to do actually is invert that and then put that on a black background so that I can see it a little better. White on black always seems to kind of throw me a little bit as I'm texturing, so maybe it's just that I like the darker version a little better. But you can see as a 4K texture, it's pretty large. Usually I would shrink the UVs a little bit away from the edges so we got a little border there, but in this case we're not going to go all the way to the edge, so it's not really going to be an issue. All right, so we also need to open up our concept art. Now I don't have this actually saved, so we're actually going to have to paint this up. Okay, so if you look at all of this stuff, I don't remember how much of this is legitimate or how much I just kind of BS'd, but I think I was trying to make it seem like he was journaling on his journey to grab this amulet. This was actually supposed to be painted in and be that ticket that you saw. So we just got little journal entries here, and this is all in my handwriting. So we can kind of play with getting this in here. And just to quickly get an idea of how this would work in Blender, because I'm going to spend quite a bit of time doing this if we're going to paint this up, I want to make sure that everything is kind of set up correctly. So let me go ahead and grab my Wacom tablet. Let's see how much time we got left. We got half an hour, so I'm probably not going to get this done, but I'm just going to play with our settings here a little bit. So for this type of thing where it's just on a flat surface, we're literally using my handwriting for this because it's a journal entry, stuff like that. I prefer to stick with Photoshop instead of jumping into Substance or something like that, because we're not going to need to do tons of multiple maps. And, you know, quite frankly, I still prefer Photoshop for just speed because I'm faster in it. I've got this little interesting add-on for Photoshop called Brushbox. I got this on Gumroad. It might have been free. I don't know. It might have been a little bit of money, but I follow some concept artists, and so I've got tons of brushes in here that I use from them. And so that's kind of what we need to do is right now figure out what kind of writing brush we're going to use. So I don't know if I have any saved that are going to be great for this, but we can play around a little bit and see what we got going on here. So let's play with the way this looks a little bit. So that's a decent writing brush, and we need to kind of figure out what kind of you know, handwriting attributes we want to leave with the way this is working. And so what I mean by that is the brush quality. So I've got this, and it's really clean. You see the edges are very like crisp, and so if we want a little bit more you know, interesting handwriting in the way that's looking, we need to work on the idea of how that is going into the paper. So if we actually pull up some reference of some fountain pen writing, this would be the way I would always start a texture. I would look at research and figure out what is it actually looks like, right? So we're looking for something that's a little bit more dated and not something super modern. So maybe we type in vintage fountain pen writing. And now we can kind of look at some of these and see what kind of, you know, edge attributes we have for the the patterns here. So this is a very straggly type of line. Some of that's because it's bleeding into the paper and you're getting that breakup happening. But you have to decide, do you want to let Blender do that for you with the displacement map? Or do you want to put that into the handwriting in Photoshop? And then you go from there. So all of these are a little different. You've got weird things happening, like the pen is bleeding into or blotching into areas and leaving interesting characteristics happening there. Obviously, people have really different kinds of handwriting, so that also adds to the effect. And we're going to need to be adding little variations into the handwriting so that we get little dots and marks and things like that. And ultimately, for that postcard, that's kind of what I'm hoping for, is something like this. So this is what we will play with as our reference. Now, rather than creating an entire brush from scratch, what I will probably try to do is start with something that I already have and then work my way back from there. So I'm going to jump into this library and try to find something as a good starting point that seems like it's in the ballpark. So in this case, kind of see the texture on that brush as we paint with it, and it's picking up a little bit of that canvas sort of texture underneath. So that adds a little bit of interesting variation, but it's not quite what we're after in this case. This has got a bit more of a tapered edge. So that's more of like what you'd see with a fountain pen, probably like this, is that it's a little bit got a nib that's got some shape to it, right? So that's a possibility. So these are more like what you'd see with maybe charcoal, something like that. So you just need to kind of play until you find something that works. Yeah, still a little bit dry there. So I'm not actually sure with the latest version of Photoshop, there might actually be a setting for canvas that I can change around that will adjust the surface that these are going down on. So these all seem like they have that same sort of rough texture behind them. Okay, so that's kind of interesting. We've got those edges are a little bit more straggly, like I was just talking about with the other pen image. So I kind of like that. I think that might be a little bit better way to go with the brush that we use here. So let's use this, get rid of all of that. And we'll start with something like, journal entry. So before I get going on this, well, we don't really have time. So I'll just go ahead and start working on this. I do have this original file somewhere that should have this stuff in layers. So maybe we have all of this handwriting saved somewhere. But rather than go digging for that, I'll just go ahead and start painting. Okay, so there's a couple of ways we can do this. I actually wrote this in cursive, so this is going to be kind of interesting. But let's start with something like that. And then do an underline. So I'm just going to kind of copy what I have here. What's interesting about this is we have these lines going across for the UV map, and I can actually use those to help me keep my handwriting straight. So it's kind of good. And the idea here is that, he was out in the field when he wrote this. So we're not obsessed with making sure it's perfect. In fact, if it's less perfect, it looks more realistic, right? So we just want to be quick. Make sure I even understand the names that I used here. Doesn't really matter. You can see just by keeping it loose and fast, we're getting a little bit better breakup, and it feels unique, right? And we're not using a font, we're handwriting this, and it's going to make a big difference when it comes time to see this in Blender. Got stroke variation happening, so all that adds up to being something that feels authentic. So if you've ever done this with a graphics tablet, it's not the easiest thing to do in the world, is handwrite this, but so yeah, I don't know what's happening behind this. Locked away in a hidden, let's say it's compartments. Of the northern okay, northern, let's say chamber of the king's sarcophagus. So in this case, you got to ask yourself who's writing this, who the character is. Are they going to have spelling mistakes? Is that part of the story? Most people don't spell perfectly. I'm not even paying attention right here. I hope this all makes sense. Let's see what this says. I can't speak enough. Something incredible fortune of a. Okay, we'll just say I make this up. I can't speak enough about the incredible historical significance of this find. The exclamation point to be a little bit more interesting. Yeah, there we go. All right. So it's enough to get started. And remember, we're going to leave room for the little drawing over here and all that kind of stuff. So now that we have a basic texture going, let's go ahead and save this out and then jump into Photo or Blender and see how this looks. So I'm just going to leave this as a black and white map. I'm going to go ahead and save the Photoshop file. And then let's save another version. So depending on what you want to do with your textures, you want to pick an image format and kind of stick with it throughout the project. I typically don't use JPEGs for anything that I'm going to render because there's image quality loss as you save and compress that. PNGs are kind of my go-to. In school, we use Targas a lot. And then TIFF is probably the best, most uncompressed version format you can use. Blender will actually read Photoshop files, but I would not recommend because of the way it reads layers. Probably using that because the file types are larger. So to save room, you want to use something that is kind of a mix between uncompressed and then not huge. So I stick with PNGs a lot. So in this case, I'm going to do journal, and we'll do, let's just call this journal color. It's not really color, it's more of an alpha relay. I don't know what you'd call that and the way we're gonna set this up, but let's get started with that. Okay, let's jump back into Blender. Okay, so if we have our UVs here and we open our image file that we saved, it should line up in the exact same way it was in Photoshop. So you can see what that's doing. And we're going to use this as a map to kind of get this handwriting onto our existing texture. So now if we jump back into the node editor, we have our basic paper material here. We don't want to be on the edges. We want to make sure we're on the interior pages right here. And in fact, don't remember what the cover pages is for. Okay, yeah, those are the inside pages right here. For a second, I freaked out. I was like, wait, what are we doing? So let's start with duplicating this. Our handwriting will be somewhat black, so we'll go ahead and make that something like that. We have to decide whether we want it to be a little bit more shiny than the paper. In this case, well, we're actually picking roughness. So yeah, maybe a little less rough. So if it was ink, maybe we'll take this down to a 0.1 and just kind of guesstimate that. And then what we need to do is bring in our image texture. So we'll pick image texture, open that up, and make sure we grab the right one. Okay, now what we're interested in is, in this case, going to be the color output. So if we preview this, you should see the black and white image. Now, we have to make sure that it's using the UV coordinates. So let's go ahead and from the existing texture coordinate node over here, let's pull over a UV into vector. And then we can see that it is using the UV coordinates, but they are not the right way around. So we need to figure out how they got flipped around and if it's just upside down or if it's backwards as well and all of that. So in this case, let's split this window and pull open the UV editor again. Sometimes if it's just something simple, you can edit the UVs and you won't even have to re-export the image and jump back into Photoshop. So in this case, if I just flip it from top to bottom with scale it on the y-axis by -1, let's see if that does it. Okay, so in this case, we also need to flip this left to right, if that makes sense. So I don't think this will work if I do this, but we can try it. Yeah, so it's the right way around, but it's on the wrong page now. So we could try selecting this page and then just flipping this one by itself. That'll do it. But it does change the layout of our UVs a bit. So if that mattered, we would want to play with that a little bit. But in this case, maybe it doesn't. So let's also grab this. And just to make sure that we do indeed need to flip this around, before we make too many committed decisions here, let's go ahead and add in a new image map. Yeah, this happens to me a lot. Not really paying attention to which UVs are around, and then I have to come back and pay for it. All right, so what I did is just added in a new blank image, and now what I'm going to do is just start painting this up a little bit so we can tell what's what. So let's switch this to paint. Let's grab a color, paint here, and going to swap this out for the untitled image that we are currently painting on. Oh, crashed. What? That shouldn't have happened. Crazy. Okay. Oh man, did I not save? This also happens far too often. No, I didn't save. Oh, well. All right. Well, we can go ahead and fix this now that we're here. Then it will probably be time to go. But I'm going to go ahead and show you how to set this up anyways. So let's start with a new image here. So we'll go to the interior pages one more time. And let's start with a texture. Yeah, I don't know if that'll work. Can try. Oftentimes it won't. Hey, it worked. Thank you. Thanks for the suggestion. It did work. Okay. Okay. Whew, here we go. So we want to be on interior pages again. All right, we're right back where we were. And let's just, instead of switching into cycles, let's switch it into textured mode. And we can see where we're at again. Okay, so yeah, we need to flip these around. And I'm gonna go ahead and try that again. Save one more time. Let's get rid of this, create a new image file. Paint this up. And we want to select the untitled image. Okay, there we go. Okay, so this needs to be flipped from top to bottom. And that needs to be flipped from left to right. Okay, there we go. So we'll get rid of that image. Switch back to our journal page. And let's get rid of that. Okay, so I am going to not keep playing with the orientation of our UVs because it's going to take me a minute to figure that out. But what I will do is go ahead and show you how to layer this on. So this will go in terms of the black and white image into the mix. So what we're going to do is take the existing shader here. And let's switch back to rendered view. Out of edit mode there. Take a drink real fast. Okay. So grab a mix shader, put it here. We're going to take the handwriting ink in this case, and we want to layer that on top. Now, in this case, we need a mix shader, not a color mix. So this will go in the right socket. The color will go into the factor, and then that's how you get the this on top. Now, if you have an alpha map instead of a black and white image, so if you have colors you want to use and all that, you can save it out with transparency and use the alpha channel into the factor instead. That will also work. So that's how you do it. Let's isolate this real fast. Okay, so bear in mind, it's actually using a different material to go down on top of the paper that's underneath. And it is going to be affected by the bumpiness of the paper. But we also need to decide if we want this to be a little bit different in terms of the way that it's reflecting light, or if we want it to feel like it's kind of indented or impressed in the paper, sometimes that can be something you want to do. And in this case, we could do that automatically since we already have a black and white image map, play with that a little bit and get that in there. Or we can go ahead and just add a little bit of more reflection into that. So what I might do is play a little bit with this ink texture here. And let's say I want to give it a little bit of sheen. Take the glossy. In this case, it might even just make more sense to turn this into a glossy shader. Turn the roughness up quite a bit, something like that. There we go. And then now, when we look at this, there may be a little bit of subtle variation as it shifts around the paper. So we can play with that. Notice even with it not being pure black, it's still very black. And so we need to decide too, if we have a little bit of a colored ink, and play with that here, pull the brightness up a little bit. And you want it to feel like it's strong, but it doesn't need to be pure black. This isn't a black hole. This is writing. And you can also play a little bit with shifting that color around with variation. So let's say, I got a little bit of time. Before we end this, let's say we wanted to add a little bit of color variation. We could take something like a color ramp, or we could use maybe even a gradient. Let's play with let's play the gradient texture. So we're going to look at this. You can see a little bit of what that looks like. Play with the different kinds of gradients. So from here, we are getting kind of an interesting wipe from one side to the other. So if you wanted to play with the sheen of the handwriting, what we might do in this case is pass this off into something that will give it some color again. So maybe a color ramp. And then we say, okay, anything that's black, let's start with this color. And anything that is over here towards the middle, maybe I want to go even a little darker than that. Or maybe brighter. Maybe I want to do something like this so it brightens up and fades into the highlight, right? So then we pass this color into the color input. And now when we look at the whole shader, this will fade and get brighter as it falls into this crevice over here. So we may have to play with how this is fading from one side to the other. Sometimes you need to play with the brightness to actually see it doing anything. Yeah, there you can see what it's doing. It's kind of getting a little sheen there. So that makes it a little bit more like metallic. And it could be kind of interesting depending on what you want to do with it. It's a little too much, so we want to dial that back. But this also makes it look a little bit more aged in terms of the way that it's coming across, and adds some variation to the handwriting. So it's kind of interesting. All right, guys, we're getting close. All right, so let's play a little bit with the layout. Let me try to fix this before we wrap this up tonight. I'm gonna save again. Okay, so that is the wrong side. So there we go. And now, yeah, so that's wrong too. Whoops. Yep, there we go. All right, that's better. So what I would probably do now is go back into Photoshop, and I'm going to add more ink blotches. And if you actually look at the concept art, let me turn that off real fast. Let me pull this up real fast. Kind of see there's some ink blots happening over here. So before we get done with this, there could be a whole lot of interaction going on in the scene. We're going to have to put something in this amulet over here, or this amber fossil over here. I'm thinking maybe Suzanne the monkey, maybe put her in there. The map process for the way we do the journal is the same way. And quite honestly, if you're going to layer paint or anything like that on top of the china, it's going to be the same process as far as texturing goes. You can do a black and white image, you can do alpha, layer that on there. If you want, you can go into Substance and project it on, but in this case, it should be pretty easy to unwrap this flat. Again, money the same way. So the only difference here with the coins is that we're going to have to project something that gives it some depth. Maybe we do a quick sculpture with a black and white relief image, and then get a normal map generated that we can quickly drop into that. We're not going to spend nearly as much time on this as we have the spoon. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, go back to the other streams that I've done so far, and you'll see me talking about texturing up the spoon, which I'm very proud of, but it took far too long. And obviously, we're going to spend quite a bit of time working on this Atlantean Amulet. So that's it. Tonight, I think we are going to call it good. And so that's going to be it for the streams this week. Definitely use the coupon code that you have in the description for the YouTube channel. Like, subscribe, follow me, please. Share me with everybody that you know. I really want people to be able to jump into the guild and learn something and get going on these new projects. Blender is blowing up. It's going to start being used in more and more things mainstream. If you want to be a part of learning and keeping up with that curve, then you need to be able to get some training, and you need to be able to share with people and sharpen your skills. And that's all about having good mentors and practicing, right? So don't just watch the stream. Make sure you open Blender and you actually work on stuff. All right, so I'll be back next week, Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday at 7 p.m. Central Time. You can watch me on Twitch, Picarto, or YouTube. And definitely, get out there and start blending, guys. So hope you have a good weekend. And welcome to the Orange Guild. Thanks, guys. I'll see you.